You tossed a 65-year-old woman in her own driveway while she was holding grocery bags. That was the moment the shouting stopped. George, her husband, didn't fight back. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at the SWAT commander and said 5 words. "Call Colonel Reed right now." What happened next will leave you speechless. The rifles dropped, the radios went silent, and within the hour, a black SUV with no plates rolled up the street. The man who stepped out wasn't here for revenge. He was here for truth and to remind them. The quietest man in the room is often the most dangerous. Welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. That man never raised his voice, not once. But the way people listened when he finally spoke, it felt like command came through quiet and absolute. That's how I described George Wallace. To the folks on our quiet block in Fairview, Colorado, George was just the old guy who fixed cars in a dusty garage that hadn't changed since the 80s. Every morning, like clockwork, he'd roll up the door with a squeal, revealing a battered red toolbox on a workbench older than me. He didn't advertise, didn't ask for payment, just helped. And when he wasn't elbow deep in grease, he was walking hand in hand with Ruth, his wife of 40-some years. I think through the neighborhood trail that looped around Old Mela Ridge Park. Same routine every evening right before the sun dipped behind the ridge. Slow steps, quiet laughs. A kind of peace you don't see much these days. But here's the thing. No one really knew George. Not really. No plaques on the wall. No war stories at the 4th of July barbecue. Just a man with calloused hands and a calm voice who always seemed to show up right when you needed him. I'll never forget the first time I talked to him. It was the night of that freak snowstorm 2 winters back. The kind that knocks the power out before you even finish your dinner. I had a newborn in the house. No heat, no generator. I was on my porch with a flashlight and zero clue what I was doing. That's when George showed up. Didn't say a word. Just walked over, nodded once, and bent down by the old gas generator. I hadn't touched in years. He had a wrench in one hand and a worn thermos in the other. Took him less than 10 minutes to get the thing purring like new. I offered him money. He shook his head. "You needed it," he said simply. Then turned around and walked back into the dark. It wasn't what he did that stuck with me. It was how he did it. Calm, purposeful, like he'd done this 100 times before in situations 100 times worse. That was the first time I noticed it. That strange steadiness in his eyes. You see, most people get jittery when the world gets loud. But George, the louder things got, the quieter he became. He had that stillness, the kind that settles on a battlefield once the dust clears. I didn't understand it back then, but I would soon enough because George Wallace wasn't just the man next door. He was something else entirely. But what secret was hidden behind his calm demeanor? It started with a siren, not the long drawn-out kind you hear from ambulances on the highway. This one was sharp, close, and angry. I was sipping my coffee by the window when it happened just past 8:30 in the morning. Sunlight was crawling across the fence lines. Everything about that moment said normal until it wasn't. 3 black SUVs came screaming down the street, engines roaring like they were chasing a war. They didn't slow. They didn't hesitate. They came to a full stop right in front of George's house. Tires screeching, doors flying open before the dust had even settled. Then came the shouting, "Get on the ground now. Hands where we can see them." I froze. Coffee halfway to my lips. At first, I thought it was a drill. Maybe something for training. Some sort of a mistake. But then I saw them tactical gear, face shields, rifles drawn, real and moving fast. They swarmed George's driveway like ants on a dropped cookie. And George, he was right there in the garage wiping down a socket wrench with a rag, same as he always did. Calm, focused, he didn't even flinch until the first officer lunged. That's when it hit me. They thought he was someone else. Later, I'd find out the full story that someone at headquarters had pulled the wrong address. 588 Oak Hill Drive was what they were supposed to hit. George lived at 588 Oak Hill Road, a half-mile apart. Same zip code and nearly identical house fronts. A clerical error. One line on one map. That's all it took to bring the war to George's front door. They didn't give him a chance to explain. One of the younger officers barked something, then shoved George to the ground hard. I watched as his shoulder hit the concrete with a sickening thud. His cap rolled into the bushes. The rag in his hand fluttered to the driveway like a white flag. But George didn't fight, didn't shout, just turned his head slowly, engine grease still on his fingers, and said, "You've got the wrong man." They zip-tied his wrists like he was a threat. Pressed a boot into his back. He didn't resist, but I saw it. That same stillness in his eyes. That unsettling calm I'd only seen once before on the night he fixed my generator. Except now it wasn't just quiet. It was coiled, controlled. Waiting. Then came Ruth. She must have just gotten back from Palmer's Market. Plastic bags dangled from her arms. Milk, eggs. A bundle of celery sticking out of the top. She stepped out of her sedan. Confusion written all over her face. "George," she called out, one foot still in the car. Three of them turned immediately, weapons raised. It all happened too fast. "Drop the bags." Someone yelled. "Hands where we can see them." Ruth froze. I saw her lips move, but I couldn't hear the words. Maybe she said please. Maybe she was just trying to understand. She tried to lower the bags, but her hands shook. Her fingers curled from the arthritis. One bag slipped, tore, apples tumbling across the pavement. "Non-compliant." A young voice barked. Then the taser fired. The sound cracked across the air like a whip. Ruth's body seized violently and she collapsed in a heap beside the spilled groceries. Her arm bent wrong, her head hit the concrete, and George, still face down, still restrained, didn't scream, didn't move. He just said, clear, level, and sharp enough to pierce the chaos. "That's my wife." But no one listened. I watched it all from my window, paralyzed by fear, disbelief, and something I don't like to admit. Helplessness. I didn't move. I didn't go out. I just stood there with my hands trembling against the glass. They kept shouting. They kept searching. They kept treating George like a suspect. And all I could think was, you have no idea who you're dealing with. But what would George's next move reveal? They say some people shout to be heard. George Wallace, he didn't have to. Even flat on the ground, hands bound behind his back with his wife unconscious just feet away. He didn't curse. He didn't scream. He didn't even raise his voice. He waited. I watched from the window, barely breathing as the shouting started to fade. Maybe it was the shock of Ruth lying so still. Maybe it was the silence George carried with him, the kind that made noise feel ashamed of itself. The SWAT commander finally stepped forward. Not the kid who pulled the trigger, not the loud ones. This man was older, maybe mid-40s, with a jaw clenched so tight it looked carved from concrete. He nodded once to a nearby officer. "Let him up just for a minute. Let him check on her." The boots eased up. George slowly sat up, then rolled to his knees. His arms were still bound behind him, but he didn't complain. He just leaned over Ruth, checked her pulse with his cheek like he'd done it 1,000 times before and whispered something none of us could hear. Then he looked up, not at the officer beside him, not at the team still pointing rifles. He looked directly at the commander and calmly said, "Call Colonel Reed right now." That was it. 5 words, not shouted, not barked, just stated. Like a fact too heavy to argue with. At first, the reaction was exactly what you'd expect. One of the younger guys snorted, "What's that supposed to mean? Is that your lawyer?" Another one muttered, "Sir, we've got an operation in progress. This guy's stalling." But the commander didn't laugh. He didn't speak either. He just stared at George. Something about the name, Colonel Reed, had hit a nerve. Then George spoke again, still in that same even tone. Left jacket pocket. Check it, but don't touch anything else. The commander hesitated, glanced at the others, then knelt beside George, reached into the old brown canvas jacket and pulled out a small black leather case. It looked like nothing until he opened it. Inside was a metallic badge tarnished at the edges, but unmistakable, Black Eagle insignia, 2 gold stars, and below it a single line engraved in silver. Tier 1 clearance retired George Wallace. That was the moment. The moment everything froze. The radios didn't crackle. The rifles didn't twitch. Even the air seemed still. One of the older SWAT team members stepped forward, not with force, but with a kind of reverence. He looked at the badge, then at George, then back at the commander, and he whispered, "Sir, that's not just military. That's Black Ops. Tier 1 protocol. That's above us." The commander's face drained of color, his hands tightened around the badge. Then slowly, he stood up and stepped back. 45 minutes. That's how long the street stayed frozen. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains, phones pressed to ears, but no one dared step outside. The SWAT team didn't leave. They didn't move much either. They were no longer shouting, no longer charging from doorway to driveway. They were waiting. And George, he just sat beside Ruth, her head resting on his lap, now his thumb gently brushing her temple like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to this world. His hands were still bound, but he didn't ask for them to be cut. He didn't need to because he had already said the 5 words, and now the world was catching up. Then it came. A black SUV, no markings, no plates, rolled silently down the street like it didn't belong on pavement. It stopped just behind the last SWAT vehicle. Not a siren, not a flash, just presence. The door opened and Colonel Samuel Reed stepped out. Not in uniform, no badges, just a tailored charcoal gray suit and a face carved from 20 years of hard decisions. He didn't look around, didn't pause. He walked straight up the driveway. The air shifted like heat radiating from asphalt, except colder. Sharper, the kind of energy that tells trained men, this is someone you stand for. The SWAT commander tried to intercept him halfway, stammering an explanation. Reed didn't break stride, didn't speak. He simply walked past the commander, past the rifles, past the fear, and stopped right in front of George. And for a second, the world held its breath. They didn't salute. They didn't shake hands. They just looked at each other. Decades of shared memory passed between them in silence. The kind of history that's never written down, only carried. Then Reed knelt, not out of weakness, but out of respect. He looked at Ruth, then at George, his jaw tightened. And when he finally stood, he turned to the stunned SWAT team and spoke with the voice of someone who hadn't raised his tone in years because he never needed to. "The man you put on the ground." He pointed at George without turning his head. "Wrote the handbook you memorized in basic training. Not a sound, not even a cough. And the woman you tossed." His voice dropped quieter and yet somehow heavier. "She's the only reason he ever left the field." One of the younger officers shifted visibly, shaken. Reed looked over the group slowly like he was scanning for names he'd have to remember later. "You didn't just hit the wrong address." He let that sentence hang in the air. "You hit the wrong legacy." You could feel it in the air. That's silence after a storm. Not relief, not peace. Just the weight of realizing you'd gone too far and couldn't undo it. Colonel Reed stood firm at the edge of the driveway, eyes locked on the SWAT commander. The man had stopped speaking entirely. No more excuses. No more authority. Just shame, the kind that doesn't show. In words only, imposture. Reed's voice was quiet but absolute. The officer who deployed the taser stepped forward. Everyone knew who it was. The young one barely out of his 20s, hands still trembling, eyes wide like a deer caught in someone else's disaster. He stepped out of formation. Didn't speak. Didn't blink. "Remove your gear," Reed said. The young man obeyed. Vest, badge, sidearm placed one by one on the hood of the nearest vehicle. But before Reed could say another word, George, still kneeling beside Ruth, still in pain himself, looked up, and what he said next, it didn't sound like a demand, didn't sound like forgiveness either. It sounded like something much harder. "Grace, he made a mistake," George said, voice low but steady. "We've all been there, especially when we were that young." Reed turned surprised. The rest of the team looked up, too. George held the young man's eyes, not with anger, not even disappointment, but with a kind of quiet understanding. "Don't throw his life away for one moment of panic," he added. "Teach him what that moment cost. Let him earn back what he almost lost." Reed was silent for a beat. Then, with a nod that carried the weight of command and respect, he turned back to the officer. "You're reassigned, effective immediately. You'll report to the VFW every Thursday morning, and you'll learn from the man you nearly put in a casket." The officer nodded slowly, tears fighting to escape his eyes. "Thank you, sir," he whispered. But it wasn't to Reed. It was to George. Then Reed reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out a sealed envelope, and extended it. "This contains a formal apology," he said. "And reinstatement of your Tier 1 clearance. If you want back in, the door's open." George looked at the envelope, but he didn't reach for it. He glanced at Ruth, still resting, though color had returned to her face, and then back at Reed. And finally, he spoke. "I appreciate it, James, but I already have a job." Reed raised a brow. George let out a breath. "I fix things now. Engines, lawnmowers, and sometimes people." He stood slowly, helping Ruth to her feet with gentle hands. "I serve here," he added, looking around at the quiet neighborhood. "And I'm not done yet." Reed smiled just a flicker and placed the envelope on the porch railing. "Offer stands." Then he turned and walked away. A week passed. The yellow tape was gone. The SUV was gone. Even the apology letter, still unopened, had disappeared from the porch railing. But something in the neighborhood had changed. You could see it in the way people walked past George's house now. Slower, more thoughtful. Like they were walking past a monument, not a garage. Like the man inside wasn't just fixing engines, but holding something sacred together. And maybe he was. Ruth recovered slowly. Her bruises faded. Her steps grew steadier. She never spoke about what happened that day. Not to me, not to anyone. But when she walked down to Palmer's Market the following week, she did it with her head held higher than ever before. George, he never missed a beat back in the garage the very next morning. Same flannel shirt, same thermos of black coffee, same gentle nod to anyone who passed by. But word had spread quietly but thoroughly. Not through news articles, though someone had tried. Not through headlines, though the body cam footage had been lost conveniently. No, it spread the way truth always does. One conversation at a time. I saw it first when a patrol car slowed to a near stop outside his house and the officer inside saluted. Not a wave, not a casual nod. A salute. Then came the visitors, some in uniform, some not. None with cameras, just quiet people carrying memories, regrets, respect. A woman left a box of homemade cookies with a note. "My brother served under you." A young man brought an old photograph with half the faces blurred. George accepted them all with a nod. Never pride, just peace. One morning, I caught him under the hood of a police cruiser tightening a belt. The young officer beside him stood like a student at attention. When I asked later what they talked about, the officer just said, he told me how not to panic. Told me about stillness, about choosing calm even when everything screams for chaos. That stuck with me. Because that's what George was, wasn't he? Stillness in a world that had forgotten how to be still. He wasn't a man looking for war. He was a man who had lived it and chosen to build afterward. The kind of man who didn't ask for justice because he was the standard. The last time I really saw him, was on a Saturday. There was a kid on a skateboard. Must have been 12, maybe 13. He wiped out hard right in front of George's driveway. Skinned his elbow, burst into tears, just laid there embarrassed. George didn't laugh, didn't scold. He walked over, knelt beside the boy, and handed him a rag. "Here, this one's clean." Then he waited. Just sat beside him on the curb while the boy dabbed at the blood. No lecture, no fuss, just presence. When the boy asked, "Did you ever get hurt like this?" George chuckled once and said, "Son, the trick isn't not getting hurt, it's learning what to do afterward." I stood across the street, hands in my pockets, watching the whole thing. And that's when I realized something. George Wallace had saved lives on foreign soil, had trained warriors, written doctrine, carried missions no one would ever know. But his greatest act of service was staying. Staying in this quiet street, staying beside his wife, staying available to anyone who needed fixing. He could have walked away. He could have demanded vengeance. But instead, when he picked up his wrench, picked up his dignity, and he stayed. I still hear people talk about him sometimes. Not loudly, just in passing. Like a ripple in the water that never truly stops. And every time I walk past that garage, I slow down. I look at the porch and I remember. Not the raid, not the fear, but 5 words spoken without force that changed everything. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way. Often in the quietest places, not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.